Emma Wilson adjusted her plain black uniform as she walked up the impossibly long driveway of the Morgan estate. Her worn sneakers crunched on the pristine gravel, each step reminding her how out of place she was in this world of opulence. At 25, this wasn't where she'd imagined herself, cleaning floors and dusting priceless artifacts for one of the richest men in the country. But life had a way of rewriting plans, especially when you were desperately trying to pay for your younger sister's medical bills. The morning fog hung low over the manicured gardens surrounding the mansion, giving it an ethereal quality that made Emma pause to catch her breath. The Morgan estate wasn't just a house, it was a statement. 14 bedrooms, indoor and outdoor pools, a private cinema, and gardens that stretched farther than Emma could see. She'd been working here for just 2 weeks, and still couldn't believe places like this actually existed outside of movies. "You're early," said a crisp voice behind her. Emma turned to find Mrs. Porter, the head housekeeper, emerging from the side entrance. With her steely grey hair pulled into a tight bun and permanently pursed lips, Mrs. Porter was as intimidating as the mansion itself. "Good morning, Mrs. Porter. I wanted to get a head start on the East Wing today," Emma replied, trying to sound confident. Mrs. Porter checked her watch. "Very well. Mr. Morgan will be leaving for his London trip at noon, and he's requested that the house be immaculate. His son is returning from boarding school today, and apparently the boy's mother will be making one of her rare appearances." Emma nodded, making mental notes. In her short time here, she'd never seen the Morgan heir. Only photographs of a solemn-looking 8-year-old boy with his father's piercing blue eyes and his mother's delicate features. The staff rarely mentioned Mrs. Morgan, except in hushed tones. From what Emma had gathered, the woman had essentially abandoned her family years ago, preferring the jet-setting lifestyle of European capitals to motherhood. The mansion was eerily quiet as Emma moved through the vast corridors. She had been assigned the family's private quarters for cleaning today, normally off-limits except for special occasions. She worked methodically, dusting ornate picture frames containing family portraits that told a story of growing distance. In the earlier photos, Mr. Morgan stood proudly next to a beautiful woman with a dazzling smile, their hands resting lovingly on a toddler's shoulders. In the later ones, the woman's smile seemed forced, and the space between family members grew visibly wider. Emma was carefully polishing a mirror in what she assumed was the son's bedroom when she heard a commotion downstairs. Mr. Morgan's deep voice echoed through the halls, followed by the excited chatter of a child. The heir had arrived. She quickly gathered her cleaning supplies, not wanting to be caught in the private spaces. As she hurried toward the service stairs, Emma collided with someone turning the corner, a small figure who stumbled backward from the impact. "I'm so sorry," Emma gasped, reaching out instinctively to steady the boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, dressed in an impeccable school uniform, with tousled dark hair and those unmistakable Morgan blue eyes. The boy looked up at her, his expression changing from surprise to something Emma couldn't quite read. His eyes widened, and his mouth opened slightly as he stared at her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, kneeling to his level. "I didn't see you coming." Instead of answering, the boy continued to stare at her, his eyes filling with tears. Then, without warning, he launched himself at Emma, small arms wrapping tightly around her neck. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You came back." Emma froze, utterly bewildered. I'm not," she stammered, trying to gently disentangle herself, but the boy clung to her desperately. "You look different, but I know it's you," he insisted, pulling back slightly to touch her cheek. "You came back for me, like you promised in my dream." Footsteps thundered up the stairs, and suddenly Alexander Morgan himself stood before them, his imposing frame filling the hallway. The billionaire CEO's expression shifted from concern to shock, then darkened to something dangerous as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the air like ice. The boy turned to his father, his face alight with joy. "Dad, Mum came back. She works here now." Alexander Morgan's face paled as his eyes fixed on Emma's face. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak, his usual commanding presence shaken. Emma had only seen her employer from a distance before. In person, his resemblance to the boy was striking, though his features were harder, carved by years of high-stakes business dealings and personal disappointments. "James, this isn't your mother," he finally said, his voice strained. "This is one of our new staff members." "But Dad, look at her," James protested, gripping Emma's hand tightly. "She has Mom's eyes, her smile. It's her." Emma stood paralyzed, mortified by the situation. "Mr. Morgan, I'm so sorry for the confusion. I was just finishing my work in the East Wing when—" "What's your name?" Alexander interrupted, studying her face with unsettling intensity. "Emma Wilson, sir. I started 2 weeks ago." A tense silence filled the hallway as Alexander continued to stare at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Emma became acutely aware of how this must look, a maid in the family's private quarters being mistaken for the estranged Mrs. Morgan. "Mrs. Porter didn't inform me that we'd hired someone new for the family quarters," he said finally, his tone measured. "It's just for today, sir. Because of your trip and—" "Dad, please," James interrupted, his voice small but determined. "Can't she stay with us? Even if she's not Mom, she makes me feel better." Something shifted in Alexander's expression, a subtle softening that transformed his entire face. He looked at his son, then back at Emma, as if seeing her properly for the first time. "Miss Wilson, I'd like to speak with you in my office," he said. "James, Mrs. Porter will help you unpack." "But Dad—" "Later, James," Alexander said firmly, though not unkindly. "Miss Wilson and I need to discuss some things." As Emma followed her employer down the grand staircase, her mind raced. Would she be fired, blacklisted from every domestic service agency in the country? Her sister's medical treatments depended on this job. She couldn't lose it over a misunderstanding. In his office, Alexander Morgan gestured for her to sit in a leather chair that probably cost more than her entire apartment. He remained standing, looking out the window at the sprawling estate. "My son has not spoken that many words at once since his mother left 3 years ago," he said finally, his back still to her. "He certainly hasn't hugged anyone, not even me." Emma didn't know how to respond. "I'm very sorry for the confusion, sir." Alexander turned, his expression inscrutable. "The resemblance is remarkable, not identical, but something in the eyes perhaps." He picked up a silver frame from his desk and handed it to Emma. In the photograph, a woman with honey-blonde hair smiled at the camera, holding a young James in her arms. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. While they weren't twins, there was undeniably a similarity in their coloring, the shape of their eyes, even the way they smiled. "Sir, I had no idea—" "Of course you didn't," he interrupted, taking the photo back. "But the fact remains that my son, who has been virtually silent for 3 years, just spoke a full paragraph and showed more emotion than I've seen since his mother walked out." He paused, studying Emma's face. "And that presents me with a rather unusual opportunity." Emma gripped the armrests of the leather chair, her knuckles turning white as Alexander Morgan's words hung in the air between them. An unusual opportunity sounded ominous, especially coming from a man whose business tactics were legendary for their ruthlessness. "Mr. Morgan, I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting," she said carefully, fighting to keep her voice steady. Alexander moved around his massive mahogany desk and sat down, his posture perfect, every inch the commanding CEO even in this deeply personal moment. He steepled his fingers, studying Emma with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to dissect her very thoughts. "My son has been through extensive therapy since his mother left," he explained, his voice softening slightly. "The psychologists all said the same thing. James has retreated into himself, convinced that if he just stays quiet and perfect enough, his mother will return. Today is the first time in 3 years I've seen a spark of the boy he used to be." Emma's heart ached for the child despite her own precarious situation. "That's terribly sad, Mr. Morgan, but I'm not sure how I want to hire you for a new position," he interrupted. "A private role, separate from the housekeeping staff. You would spend time with James, build a relationship with him, help bring him back to us." Emma blinked, certain she'd misunderstood. "You want me to pretend to be his mother?" Alexander's expression hardened. "Absolutely not. I would never allow such deception. I want you to be exactly who you are, Emma Wilson, but in a role that allows James to interact with you regularly, a tutor, perhaps, or a nanny." He leaned forward slightly. "The resemblance to Catherine might initially be what draws him to you, but it's your own character that could help him heal." Emma's mind raced. The salary for such a position would undoubtedly be substantial, enough to cover her sister Lily's remaining treatments with money to spare. But something about the arrangement felt uncomfortable, borderline exploitative of a child's pain. How would you explain my sudden change from maid to tutor? She asked, buying time to process the offer. Most of the staff haven't met you yet. We'll simply say I recognized your educational background and decided you'd be better suited to a different role. He raised an eyebrow. You do have some qualifications, I assume. Emma straightened. I have a degree in elementary education from Boston University. I was teaching 3rd grade until my sister got sick, and I needed a job with more flexible hours to care for her. Something flickered in Alexander's eyes. Surprise, perhaps even respect. That settles it then, you're perfectly qualified. Mr. Morgan, Emma said, finding her courage. While I appreciate the offer, I'm concerned about the ethics of this arrangement. James clearly believes there's a connection between me and his mother. Won't that just deepen his confusion? Alexander stood and walked to the window again, his shoulders tight with tension. When Catherine left, she told James she'd come back for him someday. He's been waiting ever since, watching every car that drives up, running to the door at the slightest sound. The psychologists say he needs closure. But how do you give closure to an 8-year-old whose mother abandoned him? He turned back to face Emma, and for the first time, she saw beyond the powerful businessman to the worried father beneath. I'm not asking you to replace her, or even to address the resemblance. Just be kind to him. Help him remember how to be a child again. Emma thought of her own sister, just 16 and battling leukemia with a courage that humbled her daily. She thought of how much Lily needed her, and how this opportunity could provide the financial security they desperately needed. I'll do it, she said finally. But we need to be clear with James from the beginning about who I am and what my role is. Relief washed over Alexander's face. Of course, we'll explain everything to him together. He extended his hand, which Emma shook, noting the strength in his grip. Welcome to your new position, Miss Wilson. We can discuss the details of your compensation package tomorrow. For now, why don't you join James and me for lunch? It would be a good opportunity to start fresh. Lunch in the Morgan mansion was an elaborate affair, even for what Alexander described as a casual family meal. The dining room could have comfortably seated 20, but today places were set for just 3 at one end of the gleaming table. James entered cautiously, his initial exuberance tempered by what had clearly been a conversation with his father about Emma's true identity. Hello, Miss Wilson, he said formally, his small shoulders rigid in his pressed shirt. Dad explained that you're not my mum, but that you'll be my new teacher. I'm sorry I confused things before. Emma's heart broke at his practiced politeness. She knelt to meet his eyes. You can call me Emma, she said gently. And you have nothing to apologize for, James. Sometimes our hearts see what they wish was true. I'm not your mom, but I would very much like to be your friend and teacher. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Dad says you used to teach other kids before you came here. That's right, 3rd graders just a bit older than you. Why did you stop? The directness of children never ceased to amaze Emma. She considered how much to share. My younger sister got very sick, and I needed to take care of her. Sometimes when the people we love need us, we have to make difficult choices. James nodded sagely, as if he understood everything about difficult choices at his young age. Perhaps in his way he did. Throughout lunch, Emma observed the interaction between father and son. Alexander clearly adored James, but there was an awkwardness between them, a distance that spoke of a man uncomfortable with the emotional terrain of childhood. He asked about James's studies, his tennis lessons, whether he'd maintained his position at the top of his class. James answered each question dutifully, but the spark she'd witnessed earlier remained hidden. As they finished dessert, an exquisite crème brûlée that Emma had to stop herself from devouring in seconds, Alexander's phone chimed. He checked it with a frown. I need to take this, he said, standing. It's the Tokyo office. James, why don't you show Miss Wilson Emma the gardens? I understand you've been helping Preston redesign the eastern section. James's face lit up at the mention of the gardens. Can I show her the koi pond too? And my treehouse? Alexander smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his severe features. Of course, just stay within the grounds. He nodded to Emma. I'll have Mrs. Porter prepare the blue suite for you. It would be best if you stayed on the property, at least initially, to help James adjust to the new arrangement. After he departed, James looked at Emma with cautious hope. Do you like gardens? Dad built me a special place where I can grow my own plants. I have strawberries and carrots and even a baby apple tree. I love gardens, Emma replied truthfully. My mom used to have a small vegetable patch behind our apartment building. We didn't have much space, but she could grow the sweetest cherry tomatoes you've ever tasted." "Really?" James's eyes widened with interest. "Is your mom a good gardener? Could she teach me some tricks too?" A familiar pang shot through Emma's chest. "My mum passed away when I was a little younger than you, but I remember everything she taught me about plants. I'd be happy to share those things with you." James's expression softened with understanding beyond his years. "So you don't have a mum either?" It wasn't a question, but a recognition, a small bridge forming between them. He hesitated, then reached out to take her hand. "I'll show you my special plants first, then the big greenhouse where Preston lets me help with the orchids." As they walked through the sprawling gardens, Emma felt something shift within her. What had begun as a bizarre case of mistaken identity was transforming into something else, a chance encounter that might help heal two wounded hearts, and perhaps her own as well. But as James chatted excitedly about his gardening projects, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a complex situation that extended far beyond a child's confusion or a father's desperation. Alexander Morgan was a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his world, and now, for better or worse, she had become part of that world. The afternoon sun caught her engagement ring, a simple band with a tiny diamond that she wore on a chain beneath her uniform. Ryan's face flashed in her mind, along with the memory of their last argument before she took this job. "You're selling yourself short, Em," he'd insisted. "You're a teacher, not a housekeeper." But Ryan didn't understand the crushing weight of Lily's medical bills, or the desperation that came with watching your only family member fight for her life. Emma touched the ring through her shirt, wondering what Ryan would say about this new development, and whether this unusual opportunity would bring her closer to or further from the future they'd planned together. 3 weeks into her new role, Emma's life had transformed completely. The blue suite that had initially intimidated her with its opulence now felt almost comfortable. Her days revolved around James's education and well-being, crafting lessons that engaged his brilliant mind while carefully nurturing his emotional growth. In the evenings, she would visit Lily at the private hospital Alexander had insisted on providing. A company benefit, he'd called it, brushing aside her protestations. Today, however, brought a new complication. Emma smoothed her dress, a simple but elegant navy blue sheath that Mrs. Porter had helped her select, and tried to calm her nerves. The Morgan International Annual Charity Gala was tonight, and Alexander had asked her to attend, ostensibly to help James navigate his first major social event since his mother's departure. "You look pretty," James said, peering around her bedroom door. At 9 years old, he was still small for his age, but the haunted look that had shadowed his eyes was gradually fading. "Dad says I have to wear a tie, but I think they feel like being strangled by a snake." Emma laughed, kneeling to help adjust his miniature bow tie. "Very dashing, you'll have all the ladies asking for dances." James wrinkled his nose. "Gross. I'm just going to hang out with Trevor. His dad works for my dad, so he has to come to these things too." "Smart plan," Emma nodded seriously. "Strength in numbers." A knock at the doorframe drew their attention. Alexander stood there in a perfectly tailored tuxedo that emphasized his broad shoulders and tall frame. Emma felt a strange flutter in her stomach that she immediately tried to suppress. "The guests are arriving," he said, his eyes lingering on Emma for a moment before turning to his son. "Remember what we discussed, James. 1 hour of mingling, then Mrs. Porter can take you upstairs if you're tired." "Can't Emma take me upstairs instead?" James asked. A shadow crossed Alexander's face. "Emma will be helping me greet guests tonight, part of her new responsibilities." This was news to Emma, but she kept her expression neutral for James's benefit. The boy's attachment to her had grown steadily over the weeks, and while she cherished their bond, she was increasingly aware of the complex dynamics at play, especially where Alexander was concerned. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and the jewelry of Manhattan's elite. Emma felt painfully out of place, despite her new dress and the simple pearl earrings Alexander had left in her room, with a note: "To complement your new role, A.M." "Relax," Alexander murmured, as they greeted yet another couple whose names Emma immediately forgot. "You're doing fine. You might have warned me about the receiving line duty," she whispered back. His mouth quirked. "Would you have come if I had?" "Probably not," she admitted, hence the omission. His hand touched the small of her back briefly, guiding her toward the next guests. The casual contact sent an unexpected warmth through her body. "Alexander," Finally allowing yourself some pleasant company, I see. The voice belonged to a distinguished-looking gentleman with silver hair. Charles Westfield, he introduced himself to Emma, an old friend of the family. Emma Wilson, she replied, accepting his handshake. Miss Wilson is James's new tutor, Alexander explained, his tone subtly warning. Charles's eyebrows rose. Ah, I see. Quite an honor to be invited to the gala, then. Alexander doesn't usually include the staff in these events. Emma felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment, but before she could respond, a commotion at the entrance caught everyone's attention. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, whispers cascading through the room. A woman stood in the doorway, statuesque in a crimson gown that seemed designed to announce her presence. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elegant chignon, diamonds glittering at her throat. Catherine, Alexander breathed, his face draining of color. Emma's stomach dropped. Catherine Morgan, James's mother and Alexander's estranged wife, had returned, her timing as dramatic as her entrance. "Hello, Alexander," Catherine said, gliding toward them with practiced grace. "I hope I'm not too late for our annual tradition." Emma watched Alexander struggle to compose himself, years of business negotiations evidently providing insufficient preparation for this moment. "What are you doing here, Catherine?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "I was in New York and thought I'd surprise you." Her gaze turned to Emma, sharp with assessment. "And who might this be?" Before Alexander could answer, a small voice cut through the tension. "Mom?" James stood frozen a few feet away, his young face a battlefield of emotion. Catherine's confident expression faltered momentarily. "James, darling, look how you've grown." She moved toward him, arms outstretched, but the boy backed away. "You left," he said, his voice small but steady. "You said you'd come back, but you didn't." "Sweetheart, it's complicated." "Miss Wilson." James turned to Emma, confusion and hurt in his eyes. "Is this why you're here? Because Dad knew she was coming back?" The accusation struck Emma like a physical blow. "No, James, I had no idea." "James, that's enough," Alexander cut in, placing a protective hand on his son's shoulder. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately." Catherine's gaze darted between them, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Well, this is interesting. Have you found yourself a replacement, Alexander? She does bear a certain resemblance to me, though clearly a budget version." The cutting remark hung in the air. Emma felt hundreds of curious eyes on her, evaluating and judging. Her instinct was to flee, but James's distress rooted her in place. "I think I should check on Lily," she said quietly to Alexander. He nodded almost imperceptibly, his jaw clenched with tension. "We'll talk later." As Emma slipped away from the ballroom, she heard Catherine's melodic laugh floating above the murmurs of the crowd. She quickened her pace, a sick feeling settling in her stomach. Whatever fragile happiness she'd found in this house had just been shattered by the return of its rightful mistress. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. "How's the fancy party? Have they discovered you're just a normal person yet?" Emma leaned against the wall, fighting back tears. What had she been thinking, allowing herself to be drawn into the Morgans' complicated world? She'd been naive to believe she could help heal their wounds without being damaged herself. Emma sat on the edge of her bed in the blue suite, her hastily packed suitcase standing ready by the door. The mansion was quiet now, the last of the gala guests having departed hours ago. She had changed out of the navy dress and back into her own clothes, jeans and a simple sweater that felt like armor after the vulnerability of the evening. Her phone lit up with another text from Ryan. "Call me when you can. I'm worried about you." She swiped it away. How could she explain everything that had happened? Even she didn't fully understand the complex emotions swirling inside her. A soft knock at the door made her heart leap into her throat. She half expected to see Catherine standing there, ready to deliver another cutting remark. Instead, it was Mrs. Porter, her usual stern expression softened with concern. "Mr. Morgan would like to see you in his study, if you're still awake," the housekeeper said. He emphasized that it's not an order, merely a request. Emma hesitated. Her instinct was to refuse, to maintain whatever dignity she had left after tonight's humiliation. But she owed it to James to at least say a proper goodbye. "Thank you, Mrs. Porter. I'll be down in a minute." The older woman glanced at Emma's suitcase but said nothing, nodding once before departing. As Emma made her way through the silent corridors, she couldn't help but reflect on how quickly she'd grown accustomed to the mansion's layout, its rhythms. its peculiar blend of grandeur and loneliness. Alexander's study door was ajar, a slice of warm light spilling into the hallway. Emma knocked gently before pushing it open. Alexander sat behind his desk, jacket discarded, bow tie undone and hanging loosely around his neck. He looked exhausted, the careful mask of control he usually wore now cracked to reveal the troubled man beneath. "You're leaving," he said, noticing her casual clothes. It wasn't a question. "I think that's best for everyone, especially James," Emma replied, remaining near the door. "Catherine's return changes everything." Alexander's laugh was hollow. "Catherine isn't returning. Sure, she came for money, pure and simple. Her new boyfriend has expensive tastes and her allowance apparently isn't covering them." The blunt assessment startled Emma. "But James has already been abandoned by her once," Alexander said, rising from his chair. "She has no interest in being a mother. Her performance tonight was exactly that. A performance designed to maximize her leverage." He moved to a side table and poured amber liquid into 2 crystal glasses. "Scotch?" Emma shook her head. "Where is James now?" "Asleep, finally. Mrs. Porter had to sit with him for over an hour." Alexander took a long sip from his glass. "He asked for you, but I thought it best to give you some space after everything." Guilt washed over Emma. In her own distress, she'd forgotten the person who needed her most. "I should have been there for him." "You're not obligated to manage our family chaos, Emma. Catherine's appearance was a calculated ambush. She knew exactly what she was doing by showing up unannounced." His blue eyes met hers directly. "You weren't the target. I was." Emma sank into one of the leather chairs, suddenly too tired to maintain her defensive posture. What did she want? A revision to our separation agreement. More money, fewer restrictions. Alexander sat in the chair beside her, rather than returning to the power position behind his desk. "I've agreed to her terms with one non-negotiable condition. She's to have no contact with James unless he initiates it when he's older. No more promises she won't keep. No more damage. Can you legally enforce that?" "I've built my career on contracts no one can escape," he said grimly. "This one will be ironclad." They sat in silence for a moment, the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel marking the late hour. Emma's resolve to leave was weakening, her concern for James overshadowing her own embarrassment. "He'll think I abandoned him too," she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. Alexander leaned forward, his expression unexpectedly vulnerable. "Please don't go. Not like this. James has lost too many people already." He hesitated, then added quietly, "And so have I." The raw honesty in his voice caught Emma off guard. For weeks they'd maintained a careful professional distance, despite the growing tension between them that both refused to acknowledge. "Alexander, The study door burst open, interrupting whatever Emma had been about to confess. James stood in the doorway, his pajamas rumpled and his eyes red from crying. "I knew you'd try to leave," he accused Emma, his small voice breaking. "Everyone always leaves." Emma was on her feet in an instant, kneeling before the boy. "James, were you even going to say goodbye?" he demanded, hiccuping through his tears. "Of course I was," Emma said, though the half-truth stung her conscience. "I would never just disappear. Like Mom did." The simple question landed like a physical blow. "James," Alexander intervened, his tone gentle but firm as he joined them, "Emma isn't leaving because she wants to. She's leaving because she thinks it's what's best for you with your mother's return." The boy's expression hardened with a maturity beyond his years. "She's not staying. I heard you talking to her. She just wants money for her boyfriend." He turned to Emma, his eyes pleading. "You're the one who helps me with nightmares and reads me stories and knows how I like my sandwiches cut. You're the one who's actually here." Emma felt tears welling in her own eyes. "James, it's complicated. Your dad hired me to help with your schooling and because I mistook you for my mom that first day," James interrupted, his perception startling her. "I know that. I'm not stupid, but that's not why you stayed. You stayed because you care about me." His certainty was absolute. "Don't you?" "Of course I care about you," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. "So much. Then why leave?" The simple logic of childhood cut through all the adult complications. Emma looked up at Alexander, who was watching them with an intensity that made her breath catch. In that moment, something shifted between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of feelings that had been building since that first meeting in his office. "Your father and I need to figure some things out," Emma said carefully. "Adult things. Like how he looks at you when you're not watching? James asked, his innocence making the observation all the more devastating. Or how you always smile different when he comes in the room? Alexander cleared his throat, uncharacteristically flustered. James, it's very late. Why don't we all get some rest and talk more in the morning? Emma will still be here tomorrow. Right, Emma? The question held more weight than its simple words suggested. Emma realized she stood at a crossroads. She could retreat to the safety of her former life, or she could acknowledge that somewhere along the way, this mansion and its 2 wounded inhabitants had become impossibly important to her. I'll be here, she promised, meaning it this time. The relief on both their faces made something warm bloom in her chest. Alexander escorted James back to bed, while Emma returned to her suite, her suitcase now seeming out of place by the door. She moved it back to the closet, unpacking the few items she'd hastily stuffed inside. As she hung up her clothes, her phone rang, Lily's ringtone. Emma answered quickly, worried about why her sister would call so late. "Em, the doctors just told me." Lily's voice was breathless with excitement. "The new treatment is working. My numbers are all heading in the right direction. They're saying if this continues, I might be in remission by summer." Joy surged through Emma, so powerful it brought her to her knees. "That's amazing, Lil. The best news." "I know you took that job for me, to pay for all this," Lily said, her voice softening. "But the nurse let slip that your boss is covering everything now. Emma, who exactly are you working for?" Emma smiled, looking around the beautiful room that had become her own. "It's a long story," she said, "but I think I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Later, as she stood by her window watching the first light of dawn illuminate the gardens where she and James had first connected, Emma heard a gentle knock. Alexander stood in her doorway, looking more approachable in casual clothes than she'd ever seen him. "Tea on the terrace," he offered, a tentative smile softening his usually stern features. "James is still asleep, and I thought perhaps we could talk about the future." Emma nodded, her heart full with possibilities that had seemed unimaginable just weeks ago. "I'd like that very much." As they walked together through the morning quiet mansion, their hands brushed, and this time neither pulled away.